I think immunology, inflammation, or I&I is very hot at the moment.
Particularly when you're in the US, and I love this because you can recognize it so quickly. There are quite a lot of companies that have very limited data, and they're just very loud.
Calliditas, obviously, is amazing success story.
The company was growing. We're getting close to profitability. Companies had been following us for a while, came back and wanted to talk. Yeah. It's actually very fun to kind of also have some network with women. You know, we can moan and groan about slightly different things. So it's fun. You shouldn't be afraid of asking questions or asking for advice. It can be much more efficient.
Bienvenue to a new episode. I'm your host, Philip, and on this show, I'm interviewing the best Europeans in biotech to help you grow. One of the best exits in recent European biotech times is Calliditas. The Swedish biotech was acquired for $1.1 billion and was run by Renee. She has now joined Hansa as CEO. So I caught up with her while we were both in Boston. I heard many great things about her, but it was actually the first time we met offline. We talked about her joining Hansa Biopharma, which has a product approved in immunology. We also talked about the behind the scenes of the exit of Calliditas and how to transition from finance to biotech executive. So here's my conversation with Renee, and please hit the like and follow button if you're enjoying it. Thanks to today's sponsor, Merck Life Sciences, to help biotech founders from day one. If you're a newly launched biotech startup, Merck's New Labs startup program is designed to help you hit the ground running. From functional genomics to purification tools, they offer 300,000 reagents, instruments, and services to accelerate your R&D. And it's not just products. Merck brings decades of expertise, supply chain solutions, and scientific guidance to help you navigate the road from ID to scale-up. Merck is also a proud partner of today's guest, Hansa Biopharma. So click the link below to claim your biotech starter guide, which is packed with helpful resources, exclusive savings, and a few extras to get your lab started. All right, welcome to the show, Renee.
Thank you.
Yeah. I want to start with you recently joining Hansa Biopharma. Just wondering, how are things going so far?
I think that they're going pretty well, honestly. Yes, I'm happy with the progress that we've made since I joined, which is now coming up to almost 2 months.
Yeah. And what led you to this decision? What led you to the decision to join?
So Hansa's always kind of been kind of in the area, or where, in and around and about where I've been operating previously. It's in the kind of kidney space. One of their kind of things is in the kidney space, and this is transplantation. But I think the platform that they have, the science that they've developed, is really fascinating. I think it's also obviously it's gone through an approval, and it's actually being used obviously today in Europe on patients. And I think it has great opportunities to kind of be, have an application in other areas as well. So I think it's a really exciting business that way.
And I guess a bit of Swedish connection as well.
There is a bit of a Swedish connection.
Right, cool. And then, so on the, you just mentioned you got the approval. So the product is Idefirix, or how you put it?
Exactly, Idefirix, yeah.
Idefirix. I think there's finished approval 2020 in the EU.
In EU, yeah.
But not in the US.
Exactly.
Yes.
No, so I think that the EMA was willing to kind of give the drug a conditional approval on the basis of a fairly small kind of 2-3 center kind of open label study.
Okay.
The US, the FDA was very clear about the fact that they wanted a control trial. They wanted a control arm. And so that really led the company to run a kind of separate phase 3 really in the US.
Okay.
And that trial is reading out now in the second half of this year.
Can we just talk a bit about the science as well? Because I think it's a enzyme IgG cleaving.
Exactly.
And there's quite a few applications. But can you go a bit in the science and the applications?
Sure. So this enzyme is extremely efficient at cleaving IgG, and it cleaves it kind of in 2 ways. So actually, it completely kind of depletes IgG. And you have maybe like a 15-minute infusion, and after about, within 2 to 6 hours, you really have kind of depleted IgG down to less than 5%. So it's very, very efficient. And it's obviously been proven to also be very safe. And this means that you can use it in this kind of way of desensitization. So you have patients, in two, for example, two different areas. So one would be patients that are on dialysis. So they've lost their kidneys, are on dialysis, and obviously we all know that transplantation is the best option for these patients to live a normal life. But because they have very high levels of kind of antibodies, the chances of them ever getting a match is extraordinarily small, very, very limited. So these patients are on dialysis for extended periods of time, years and years and years, and often they will die on dialysis. So in this case, actually, we can use this drug to kind of then reduce these antibody levels very, very significantly. And obviously, it's important that it happens quickly, because obviously, if you're going to do a transplantation, you have an organ, you need to call in the patient. You can't have the patient kind of, waiting for weeks to kind of get to that point. So it's very, very well adapted to that.
And so it's a kind of more temporary thing before the transplant, or is it
Exactly.
ongoing after the also after?
No, so but the fact that it cleaves all the existing IgG means that you kind of get down to these levels, and then of course the B cells will now start producing again. But it takes quite a long time for that process to kind of reach any kind of significant levels. So you basically have a very, very low level of IgG for maybe, let's say, a week or so.
Okay.
Week to 10 days, and then it'll start kind of, rebounding. But that's obviously enough for kind of the what's important is that you don't have those kind of antibodies present when you actually do the transplant. And in the first couple of, days, obviously, as you kind of follow that. And then as they come back, and of course the physicians are aware of this, you can then manage that with existing kind of autoimmune suppression.
Okay. So you're talking about organ transplant, but I saw you have two other application. One is to facilitate gene therapy.
Yeah.
The other one is autoimmune disease. Maybe starting with the gene therapy, I guess it's a similar application as in when the gene therapy happens, you want to deplete the level of IgG to make the gene therapy more successful.
So these are, so it is very similar, but these are obviously the delivery kind of mechanism for a lot of gene therapies are AA vectors.
Yeah.
And again, sometimes because it's, these occur naturally, so you will have patients that have very high levels, very high titers of kind of AA vectors. So, and again, those patients really cannot be given gene therapy because the delivery vehicle is, it's not possible. So in this case, actually,
like isn't 1/3 of the eligible patients?
So it'll vary in different indicators, but it's quite high.
Yeah, it's high. Okay.
It is anywhere from kind of like, 15% to kind of like up to 50%. So it is a range depending on kind of different drug products. But this again is obviously, as you can imagine, for those companies who have been pursuing gene therapies, and so now have a commercial product, not to be able to reach all of those patients that are eligible under their label.
Yeah.
So this is obviously something that the company entered into a agreement with Sarepta.
Yeah.
And Sarepta is now running basically a proof of concept study, doing exactly this, looking at kind of depleting this kind of antibody levels down to very low levels, and then actually administrating their gene therapy, which is then in DMD patients, to these patients, and seeing will you kind of after that period of time, will you see this kind of expression in the muscle tissue exactly as you see with, patients who do not have these kind of high level of antibodies.
Just make you think that Sarepta is in the news right now. That's the best news.
No, they have had quite a lot of challenges. But this is obviously just a way that vehicle is being used by a lot of different gene therapies. So that's really data that also will be shared kind of this second half of this year.
Yeah, okay. And finishing on the autoimmune disease, because I think that's where you approvals is.
So in autoimmune disease, the companies run two different kind of proof of concept studies. One in anti-GBM, which is, again, it's an IgG-mediated autoimmune disease. But this kind of really affects kidneys, the membranes, glomerular kind of membranes, and also sometimes lung membranes. And also in Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is more of a neurological, also rare disease. But actually that's when you kind of have your immune system is really attacking your nerves. So you get kind of muscle weakness, paralysis, etc. But both of those are rare diseases and they are IgG mediated. And the company has run phase 2 proof of concept trials there, showing that, in these open trials that there was a significant difference between kind of standard of care and imlifidase.
Okay. So, and because you said the product was approved, but then I looked at the sales and it's basically around whatever 20 million in 2024.
Yeah.
Which seems not that high, but maybe just for conditional approval in Europe is also not that bad. I don't know, how do you look at it?
So I think that there were quite a few challenges for the company in terms of launching in Europe. So I think the first one was obviously it was approved really kind of at the beginning of COVID.
Yeah.
So these patients were transplantation was not kind of the kind of at the forefront of what physicians wanted to do at the time.
Yeah.
So I think that was one of the issues. And then obviously reimbursement in Europe really takes about 9 to 12 months per country to really kind of get that reimbursement in place. So we know in Europe that it's a slow start every time.
EU5 and
it is complicated. It is complicated. It takes time. But I do think that what the second thing that was going on is obviously that there were no guidelines, and in quite a few kind of the European countries, because these are really kind of sensitive patients. They are highly sensitized, but these are patients that physicians would be quite concerned about because they do have this kind of really high level of kind of rejection potential. And so that there really were no guidelines. So it's really breaking new ground. This is a novel kind of treatment. So I think that getting those, kind of those guidelines in place was very important. And thirdly, the company, obviously because it's a conditional approval, EMA also required a confirmatory study. So EMA really wanted the company to run in multiple centers in Europe a 50-patient trial. So obviously there has been, and that trial was fully recruited in the beginning of this year. So obviously you've had 50 patients that have been transplanted, but they've been transplanted outside of the commercial setting. So it's been really in a clinical trial. So the company had about maybe $15 million or so of revenues last year.
Yeah.
But this first quarter of this year had about $6.5 million in revenue. So I think that it's realistic to assume that there's going to be, pretty reasonable growth in Europe this year and next year, as you kind of have the confluence of no more clinical trial ongoing. You do have guidelines, and a lot more of the physicians are comfortable doing this transplantation and using imlifidase because they've also been in the clinical trial. So you're having a much broader usage base as well.
And I guess you're also bringing your commercial experience to the picture. Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So we brought in some people as well with kind of, very strong commercial backgrounds. So obviously we're looking at, is there something that we can do to enhance this, to kind of, accelerate growth in Europe? Are there some investments that are necessary or some reallocation? So yes, we are looking at that in terms of what we can do from a commercial perspective.
I was curious also especially on the autoimmune side. I think some of your competitors, I don't know exactly in which indication, but at least from understanding, there's argenx with their drug, which is highly, highly successful.
Highly successful.
I think UCB has a similar indication also in the autoimmune space. Yeah. Just curious how it's not the same mechanism of action, but I guess some of the application or some of the indication could be the same. How do you differentiate from them?
Yeah.
If you go in some of these areas which are frontal.
Yeah. So I think for a lot of those kind of drugs, the difference is that it's kind of it takes time to actually kind of, reduce the IgG levels. So it's not kind of an immediate effect. And also they don't necessarily reduce them that far down. So you don't kind of get to those levels kind of over time necessarily. So I think this drug, in terms of differentiation, I think it really is that you have this very rapid onset and a very kind of deep reduction really of IgG. And so I think it has been looked at in both of these kind of cases, like GBS and anti-GBM, when the immune system kind of goes haywire and kind of you have these almost shock to the system, the outcome obviously is very much dependent on how quickly can you actually kind of get this under control, how rapidly can you kind of, limit this kind of IgG storm, if you want to call it that. And this is why, for example, in anti-GBM, if you look at kind of standard of care, if you look at historical outcomes, you could see that maybe after 6 months from diagnosis, about 18% of those patients still kind of have or dialysis independent, still have a functioning kidney.
Yeah.
So in that kind of open label trial that was done in anti-GBM with imlifidase, that kind of same number was about 67%. So it is about kind of trying to kind of, you preserve the organ because you don't have this extended exposure of kind of this autoimmune attack. So obviously it is more for kind of, I would call, acute or flare type kind of a situations. What I think a lot of the other drugs are much more kind of it's almost like a maintenance type.
Chronic to tune.
Right, kind of tune, exactly. So that I think is kind of the simplest way of differentiating it.
All right. So, and so I guess you are going for indications where it's more severe autoimmune.
Yeah.
Versus those. Okay. The access. And going one of the last aspect more on the finance side.
Yeah.
I saw that I think the market cap in dollars is around whatever 100, at least in June, was $170 million, give or take. I guess it's fluctuating, which I guess right now with the lower market caps is still, still very decent. But what I saw is that your cash level was pretty low, actually. Like I think Q1 you had whatever $25 or $26 million.
Exactly. Yeah.
How do you look at this? Like, I guess.
Yes. That was clearly one of the things that was kind of brought in to try to address. It's a pretty obvious problem. And I think really the company took a loan in 2022.
Okay.
Which is probably a little bit early to kind of do that, but I mean they did, and so there is a kind of combination of having to renegotiate the loan burden for the company, as well as obviously bring in kind of additional equity capital.
Okay.
So that is something that obviously we have actually been working on from the day that I joined.
Okay.
And actually we've actually kind of launched a transaction this morning. I mean this evening, I would say, in Europe, to actually kind of we have reached some heads of terms with the lender, and also kind of bringing in some additional capital into the company.
Okay, how much are we talking about? Is it disclosed?
So this is ongoing at the moment. Frankly, it hasn't closed yet, but we've just said that we're launching that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. And I guess with your experience with Sofinnova as well, probably helps. You're calling them as well to see.
I mean, I think this is obviously one of the benefits in terms of having been through some of these things before, is that I have a fairly broad network, at least kind of relationships with investors. And so obviously the hope and the plan here is that we can actually kind of restructure some of the debt, give the company kind of a really kind of significant time of kind of breathing room.
Yes.
To both do, to read out a lot of the catalysts that are coming. We have 3 kind of big kind of data readouts the second half, but also then really kind of use this time to also do other kind of corporate deals, be that kind of maybe other gene therapy deals or outsourcing, indications or geographies, partnerships. So I think that it'll give the company an ability to kind of get onto a much more sustainable footing from a kind of capital perspective.
And I guess it's much better to have whatever 18, 24 months of runway versus 6 months.
Absolutely.
Especially in the current patents.
Absolutely. Yes, that makes everybody feel a lot better.
One thing that I saw in your investor list, which struck me, was that Redmile had somewhere around 20% of the company.
Right.
And Redmile obviously is a very high-level investor. I think they were famous for having done biotech, but a lot of others.
Yeah.
Were they already there before you joined?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, they've been with the company.
And what's the story of them investing in the company? Like, what's the background?
So, I mean, they actually invested in the business, I think, quite some time ago.
Okay.
And I know that obviously they have been following this in terms of gene therapy, for example. They're very active and kind of investing generally in that area. And I think they're very excited about the kind of potential for this drug, the way that it can be used, because I think I think it would be hard to believe that if you actually have a gene therapy franchise that you would not want to get to all of the patients that are eligible under that kind of scheme. So I think if we can show this, which we're hoping to do second half of this year, we're also working with Genathon with a different vector, a different tissue.
Yeah.
So I think actually if we can show that this actually can be used kind of in different, irrespective of vectors and tissues, I think this is an extremely exciting, opportunity.
Yeah, because once you prove it, I guess, with 1 or 2 vectors and you prove that it works, I guess then you can expand to
exactly
a lot of other gene therapies.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. That
Yeah.
makes sense. So like you mentioned your experience, so I want to transition a bit to Calliditas. Obviously, it's amazing success story. Was there, I think, $1.1 billion exit to Asahi. What I saw that they have Sofinnova, this is a growth fund, joined at least in a bit before the exit. And you have been there, I think, for what, 7-8 years?
7 years. Yeah.
So I'm curious of the whole story from you joining, and then what, like, some of the milestones and what was like a bit behind or outside the press release.
So yeah, I mean, it is a great story, I think, because so obviously when I joined, it was a very small company, 9 people, private business in something that looked more like an apartment than an office in Stockholm. But the company had been working for a long time in kind of this rare kidney disease called IgA nephropathy. They were the only company, really kind of pharma company, that run like a proper kind of randomized control study, phase 2b, large study, 150 patients, very good results. But there was this issue with, again, like, what was the regulatory pathway going forward?
Yeah.
Because the traditional kind of metrics that the kind of cardiorenal division would require, doubling of creatinine, et cetera, it's like it wasn't possible really to kind of carry out in a rare disease. So the company been working with, U.S. universities, with the regulators. They had, they published their study, and they did a meta-analysis of all kind of intervention into kind of IgA nephropathy patients, and showed that there was this kind of correlation between kind of reduction of proteinuria and the actual kind of longer term outcomes on eGFR in the kidney. And they'd been having these conversations with the FDA for quite a long time, and just kind of before then, so in 2017, FDA actually kind of said, okay, we have all of this material, all the publications, all the data, meta-analysis, we are going to allow you to actually run your phase 3 pivotal study with a potential of getting an accelerated approval on this novel endpoint. Which obviously great, but the company was kind of like, oh my God, what are we going to do?
The money to run it as well.
Yes, I mean, you need experienced people to run a global phase 3. So we ran a global phase 3 on our own. But it was 150 centers all over the world. We had to bring together a team really with experience to run global phase 3 trials, which obviously means you have to go to big pharma and try and convince them that they should come to a much, much, much smaller business. But we did that successfully, and then strategy-wise, I think I decided very early on that we could kind of commercialize this ourselves in the U.S. It was a rare disease, nothing had ever been approved. And so really, and I think the company had excellent relationships with KOLs, and so we did quite a lot of work on this and figured that we should be able to kind of do this ourselves.
How did you finance the phase 3, or what kind of announcement?
Yeah, so actually the phase 3, what we did is we went public in Sweden, and so we raised about $70 million to actually then fund the phase 3 trial, and then actually we out-licensed the drug to both China, Japan, and Europe. So that gave us additional kind of upfronts.
That's where
like $15-20 million. Exactly.
came in.
Exactly. So that kind of helped in terms of the funding. And then in 2020, we also took the company public in the US and raised about $90 million. So that was a way to actually then fund more of the pre-commercial and commercial effort.
Okay, and then once you got the FDA approval, I mean, it went pretty quickly to the exit was Asahi.
Yeah, so basically the trial was pretty much run. We started in 2018.
Yes.
With a phase 3. Took only about a year to recruit, so that was very, very good. So we read out the data. We kind of got the data at the end of 2020.
Yeah.
And then so we got the kind of conditional or accelerated approval in the US at the end, like December 2021.
Yeah.
And that meant that we could launch kind of into the market in 2022.
Yes.
So we launched in 2022, and 23 was the kind of first full commercial year that we had. And at that point in time, the drug was called Tarpeyo, and it sold for about just over $100 million in it.
It's quite a lot for first year.
It is, yeah. And we were extremely happy with that. And it really had a lot of momentum at that time. We were seeing very good growth. And we also kind of knew that we were getting to the holy grail of actually being kind of operationally profitable as a biotech company, which is an achievement.
Especially in Europe, there's not that many.
Exactly. Which we kind of achieved, in 2024. So, but I think it was based on the fact that, we got a full approval with a broader label from the kind of confirmatory study that we had also read out. So in 2024, really, we had a full approval, a very good label. We were obviously seeing a lot of momentum. The company was growing. We're getting close to kind of profitability. So I think it was on that basis that, companies who had been following us for a while, came back and wanted to talk.
Okay. And I guess you had I don't know how much it's disclosed or in your FCC filing of the deal was structured. I guess some other people, you had some discussion with other people and increasing the days as well. I don't know how much you can disclose or what was disclosed.
Yes, I mean, but I think it's a fairly typical kind of situation, obviously. So Asahi Kasei had been following us for a while. So we met them for, probably the first time we met them was probably 2 years earlier.
Okay.
When we kind of just, were talking, so they have because Asahi has a business in the US that's also in the kidney space, but in the kind of transplantation drugs. So not adjacent, but not, but still. And so I think they were obviously looking at other renal companies, et cetera. So we know each other and we'd been talking for a while. But nothing kind of, it was more like we met at conferences. We said, hello, how are things going? So,
and Asahi beer, I guess, no? It's the same company, actually, Asahi, the beer as well, no? It's a
different one.
It's a different one. I thought it was a big group.
It is a conglomerate. It's definitely a conglomerate, but it's not. It's a different company.
It's the same company.
It's the same name, but it's not that company.
Yeah.
No. So they have like home and materials as well as healthcare.
Okay. Yeah.
So those are the three kind of pillars of their business. But then I think, as I said, I think the momentum of what was going on, I think so they became much more engaged.
Yeah.
And then I think the board felt like because we were getting, serious interest, that they wanted to go out and do a market check. So we did kind of contact, a limited number of other parties that we thought could be kind of interested. And that kind of then drove, a kind of a competitive process going forward. So
I'm curious also how, again, I don't know how much you can, or how much was disclosed, but how competitive was it? I'm asking because we had actually another Sofinnova company with Mark de Garridero on the show.
Yeah.
And we went quite deep into the deal. And what was fascinating was that he talked about how it happened and how, like, he was supposed to get a bid by Friday night, wherever 8 p.m. Eastern time, and he got it like at 6:55, and the deal increased crazy story. I'm wondering for you, like, if there's some similar, let's say, stories that happened.
So I think we didn't have. I mean, I would say that it was it was a well-organized process, and we did have kind of like people kind of, obviously coming in and bidding, et cetera. But I think that in this case, because I think Asahi knew us very well, because they had been following us for quite a long time. And I think they'd kind of done quite a lot of diligence kind of from the outside in terms of kind of, they'd done quite a lot of work beforehand. And what tends to happen is that those people can move quite a lot quicker than anybody else, who's newer to the story. But I do think obviously that it's always kind of an interesting process. But the good thing is obviously you have bankers between you and the other party. And so, it helps. It helps in terms of how you frame certain things and how you kind of talk about what's really going on. So I think you obviously, it's always a matter of kind of like, you never lie.
Yeah.
It's more a matter of what information do you share and what information do you not share. So, which I think is important, right? You have to be kind of professional and kind of, keep things obviously kind of on, you can't kind of be carried away and start making things up.
Yeah.
But I do think there's always this kind of issue of like, what you leave out rather than what you say.
Makes me smile because I looked quite closely into the deal of MorphoSys with Novartis.
Yeah.
And the value was very high, but afterward there was a write down, or we call it. Yeah, it was I cannot tell too much, but it makes me smile. Okay, cool. And one thing also that I find very interesting with Calliditas, obviously it's at least European headquartered story, which, I mean, deals above $1 billion, exits from European companies is quite rare. I mean, there have been a few, but I think not much more than a dozen, I would say. What's also really interesting is that I also at least from the Sofinnova, I think they had they raised their first growth fund, a crossover fund, and it seems like it's quite a good example as well of like a European crossover fund investing, helping a European company make it to commercial, and then with a good exit as well. Like how do you look at the role of these like kind of crossover funds, especially let's say Sofinnova or European crossover funds coming in like?
So I think it's interesting to some extent because obviously this was, in the US you have quite a few of these funds, and they had kind of historically, I think, been very successful. Europe had lagged a bit in terms of kind of funds being raised that were big enough to really kind of take sizable ticket. But then I think you ended up in this situation where, you had COVID, all of these funds were kind of raised, and then you had actually a little bit of a permafrost for a period of time kind of in the public markets, which I think is quite challenging. So I think in this case, we really we knew that we were going to obviously go into the US and do kind of a US listing because we were commercializing in the US. We had a lot of people in the US. I mean, it was really important from an operational perspective to actually have a listing, have a stock price that people don't have to ask, like, what's the Swedish krona? What's this like? So it's all kind of complicated.
You put some conversion as well to prepare for this conversation.
Complicated. And so I think operation was very important to us to do that. And I think it was very also good. I mean, there's so much regulation, obviously, a lot of things when you are going to commercialize a medical product in the US. And I think it was very helpful for them to know that we were listed. We had US lawyers crawling all over us all the time. We had to kind of do a lot of, they know exactly what disclosures we have to do and et cetera. So I think it makes people feel much more comfortable. So I think that was really helpful, actually. But in this case, obviously, it was important that we had US investors as well come into the cap table before we actually kind of listed in the US.
Okay.
And so I think that actually having that kind of a little bit of a mixture of some US and some kind of European growth funds to kind of support that, I think was critical, obviously, to kind of having a successful IPO in the US.
Okay. That's good to hear. Yeah. And I saw that Hansa, I think you're considering a dual listing as well, I guess.
So I think the company has been considering it for quite some time. I think actually that the company filed, hoping, I think, to go at like even 2021.
Okay.
But then, I wasn't really there, so I don't really know what happened, but I know that that's the public information that's out there. It's clearly that they did do that. I think that obviously since kind of let's say 22, 23, 20, this hasn't been easy times for kind of the biotech market in general. And I think it's also one of the things that obviously we've had so many companies in the US that it was clear that there needed to be some kind of a, consolidation or you needed to reduce the number of kind of companies that were public in the US. Because it wasn't there, the capital wasn't there to really kind of support all of them, because some of them were also very early and would require huge amounts of money to kind of take them really through. So I think there's been, a lot of the portfolio has been, a lot of the focus of investors have been on portfolio management and really selecting kind of which companies they can afford to support. And I think obviously IPOs have not exactly been booming over the last several years. So I think, yes, there is, I think, again, that kind of operational rationale for kind of if we get an approval and going to commercialize in the US, it would make sense to kind of, have a US listing. But I think it's very much depending on the macro environment and So I think at the moment it's a little bit noisy out there. I think it's, it's a bit hard. So we'll see. We'll see.
You think one of the recent guests talked about natural selection? Right. I think it's a bit
that sounds really nice. That sounds very harsh, yes.
But there is maybe a bit of that. He was mentioned, even in Europe, he's mentioned it. Whatever, just before COVID, and COVID, there's just a lot of companies got financed. That maybe should have less or not, and there's a bit of a correction. I think it's
And I think Europe also, I mean, it's a little bit of an imbalance. I think there's actually quite a lot of capital for early stage.
Yeah.
So it's not, I mean, I'm sure people will say it's still hard to raise money. Of course, it's always hard to raise money, but I think on a relative basis, it's much more capital. There is capital available for early stage. I think what Europe hasn't had that much of, at least until recently, is have more of that kind of growth capital, that more kind of like, bigger checks that can kind of support you through, larger clinical trials or kind of potential commercialization. So
in the US listing of all that.
yeah. So I think that obviously you'll end up with a lot of kind of small companies in Europe. And then I think it becomes quite hard for those companies to kind of break through and get to that kind of next stage of funding. I think it is still very hard in Europe.
That makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. And the one thing I'm curious also is, always curious, but because the Nasdaq is running the Swedish stock exchange, what is this called, Nasdaq?
Yeah, OMX, exactly. Yeah.
How much easier does it become to then double list? Is there any or it's
I'm not sure really about
the branding thing?
I'm not sure, because obviously it's so kind of dominated by, the corporate law in each place and the different kind of rules and restrictions. Yeah,
Not really.
I haven't experienced it anyway. Let's put it that way.
Was it that? One thing you mentioned was Calliditas, that you went or you've from what I hear is you focus quite a lot on the US market.
Yeah.
Also from the
Yeah.
reimbursement point of view, I guess it's just, there's more.
Yeah.
Wondering how you, maybe if we zoom out a bit on this, I mean, and several guests on the show mentioned this, that whatever 70% of the market for their drug was in the US, so they just focused on it, even if they were European companies.
Yeah.
We had recently Verona, who's basically UK headquartered, but they basically didn't even try to launch in Europe, to just the US only, and it worked very well for them so far. How did you, I don't know, through your personal experience, but also a bit broader, how did you, when you look at this, you think about it?
So I think, I spent 12 years obviously on the investment side, investing in life sciences, spending most of that time obviously in Europe. And what you learn when you sit, I had the opportunity and benefit to kind of really look at a lot of different companies during that time. And you realize how hard it is really in Europe to commercialize. Particularly if you have one product that might be a rare product or smaller product, it really is quite difficult, because you have to go through every single country and kind of negotiate a reimbursement price. And obviously these agencies are central agencies, so it's not just because you want to have a negotiation, they may not be available, right? So they're negotiating with someone else. So it's a very kind of, it's a very slow process. It's very difficult. And obviously because you have the kind of one payer system, it becomes also quite binary. It's are you in, are you going to be, or are you not going to be? I mean, there's no in between. And so I think it's really
the willingness to reimburse is also
pay for
innovation
is much lower. And so I think it's very difficult to see how you're actually going to recoup the investment that you need to make, because it's not really like the salespeople per se, but it's all of the administration and the filings. And I mean, it's there's a lot of kind of cost that comes with kind of having, compliance and having things in all different languages, in all different companies. It's very complicated and it is very costly. And because it takes such a long time before you actually even can start selling, it becomes a very high burden on a small company. So at least in the US, you have the ability of kind of, you do your work, you do a lot of research, you talk to a lot of kind of, you do all the payer research, you try to kind of look, you do all the health economics. I mean, you do all of that work. So it's not like it's a walk in the park. It's very simple, but at least you can kind of if you do all of that in advance, then at least when you have an approval, you can actually start selling, right? You can set your price. You are aware kind of how that price, what issues or benefits that might give you. But at least you can actually kind of get going and start actually kind of commercializing. So it is much harder in Europe. And I think I saw that in so many instances, in so many kind of organizations, that I think you either need some kind of portfolio product so you can leverage your infrastructure, or you need a much bigger product. But then of course, usually if you have a bigger product, you already have a partner, because, So it's hard to find that kind of Goldilocks, combination of having a big enough product, but you can still do it as a small company, and again, you can get to a pricing level that's ultimately going to enable you to kind of get some return on that investment.
Or I guess you can start in the US, and once you have revenues from the US, I guess you can do Europe. But then your time you lost, I guess, is also not worth it. So then it's better to go with a bigger partner.
Yeah,
I guess.
Yeah. So it is a bit of it depends so much on the indication and the product and the call point, right? How many salespeople do you really need?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, because there's a big difference of kind of saying, okay, we probably need like 20 or 25, but if you need 100 or 150, I mean, it's a big difference.
For the same budget.
And so I think you really have to kind of do your homework to kind of really at least have the best information that you can to try and model this and say, is this something that we could sustainably really do?
And also now it makes also sense. I think the partnership with Stada was a more established pharma company who already has a network, already has all the contact with all the various.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And again, for them, they might need to kind of have 3 or 4 people focus on this drug, with specific kind of use, like medical affairs or certain markets. But I mean, they have all that infrastructure already kind of in place.
Yeah. One also more industry topic.
Yeah.
I'm wondering I think immunology, inflammation, or I&I is very hot at the moment. Curious if you're also feeling it.
Yeah.
Maybe from the meetings you have, how do you? Yeah.
I think it is very hot. Yeah. But I think it's also kind of interesting because particularly when you're in the US, and I love this because you can recognize it so quickly when you have some of these kind of areas, is that there are quite a lot of companies that have very limited data.
Okay.
And they're very loud. So, it's like it always happens when you have some of these areas that are developing. So I think there is a lot of interest. I think there's a lot of, and justifiably so. I think there's a lot of interest. I think there are these are significant market opportunities.
Yeah.
But it's a little bit. I mean, it's a very big difference if you talk to investors or if you talk to kind of physicians, right? They're kind of like in completely different parts of where they're thinking about this. So I think it is very interesting. I think it holds a lot of promise.
Ahead of the physicians.
Yeah, absolutely. Way down the line. So, but it absolutely, I think it holds a lot of promise and a lot of interest and justifiably so. But I think it's like most other things is that, data speaks at the end of the day.
What kind of most interesting data you've seen, or what is not the noise and not the noisy part?
I don't know if I can really. I think I've been so absorbed with trying to kind of just, learn about Hansa and trying to kind of get my arms around that science and everything else that I probably haven't had the time to kind of properly kind of look at, so many things. It'll have to come, but I haven't had a chance to do it so yet. Anyway.
Okay, because I think what maybe more for myself, but what. Yeah. I mean, the obvious one that comes to mind is argenx, which I think have been a bit early, way before the trend, but they've shown that it works super well.
Yeah.
I think in Europe, another one was we had the CEO of Leo Pharma on the show from there.
Yeah.
And there's this and they're really big in immunology.
Yeah.
Also from before, there's this massive deal, like StatSex deal with Gilead, which that's the two major, at least from, let's say, from European companies, that's kind of the two major one that comes to my mind, at least in the recents.
Yeah. No, I would agree with that. Sure. And both very successful companies.
Yes. Maybe to finish them all a bit on the personal questions, actually, you mentioned that you work quite a lot in finance, quite a lot in London, and then you transitioned to biotech CEO. How was that transition? I mean, it's not unobvious, but it's also not that obvious. How was that transition?
So I didn't think about it that much, I must say. I think it was just that, you get this opportunity. I think the thing that really was driving me to take on the job of kind of taking on the CEO job is that, again, having spent so much time on the investment side, you realize how rare it is that you actually get a product to patient, right? it's so, I mean, the big companies do, but they also have so many more things in parallel, and they can, they have a little bit more to choose from.
Yeah.
But as small companies, I mean, it's so difficult to kind of try and actually get all the way to patients. And this really was something when I kind of saw it, I felt like, it's not that complicated, right? Even I can understand it, which is good. But it had this kind of, it had a great kind of, results from clinical data.
Yeah.
And really had this opportunity of really being a pioneer in something and solving a problem that these patients really had nothing to no one's ever they hadn't really focused on this rare disease. And it just kind of felt like there were so many things that were kind of lining up that the probability of us actually taking this all the way to patient was actually reasonably high. And it's just one of those things you can't possibly say no to that, right? Because it is very exciting. And I also think that in Europe in particular, I think there's so many people who are, very good science, very deep science, excellent kind of people with great backgrounds. But I think one of the things that probably, I think it's gotten better, but I think that Europe has historically not been that good at, is really thinking about all the way through. How much is it really going to cost us to do this, right? What do we really need to do to kind of, what is the whole kind of life cycle for this product? And so it tends to be like, we'll do this trial, or, we'll get this data. And then, so I think that having a bit of that kind of, having a kind of longer view and kind of really thinking about even from a capital structure perspective, how are we going to fund this business? And realizing that you can't just go through the equity markets. You have to do corporate deals. You have to kind of try and you can do debt maybe, or converts, or, you have to try and, reach all parts of the capital structure really, because it is a very capital intensive business. And with this risk profile, it's better if you kind of divide the risk between kind of different constituencies. And so I think there is there's a great deal of value, I think, to combine some of that kind of business management, organization, structure, finance with kind of a really interesting science, and not kind of maybe lean too much into the science, because it's also easy to say this is the best thing and it's the most amazing molecule and it's like it. But it's such a global industry, and it's so quick for other people to kind of catch up. So I think you really have to have a plan that you can really execute on very, very, very quickly.
It's good. I can see. I can see the more like investor mindset, investor return, and what does it really take to go to the goal. Which especially, I mean, I think especially when you come into to a company that already has data.
Yeah,
I guess this really helps and fits really well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good. And one thing also, I think you posted something last time about quite recently, that you're trying to connect with other women in high leadership positions. Can you tell me a bit more on the why and
Sure.
and how?
Yeah, and again, I think it's something that we can all learn, we can all improve and get better. And I think a lot of times women, as this is a blanket statement that I'm probably gonna, people aren't gonna like, but I think
You can be controversial.
women, I think, tend sometimes to be very task oriented.
Yeah.
Very focused on solving the problem, getting it fixed, moving it forward, and forgetting sometimes about all the value kind of in networking, right? So I think that sometimes we're not as good at actually kind of reaching out and calling people and asking questions and doing things. And I think I've always worked in quite male dominated environments.
Finance, I guess.
And that is one of the things I kind of, learned kind of early on, that, I was trying to, I don't know, go home and read a book or figure it out or what was going on. And, the guy on the desk next to me just picked up the phone and, had it solved in 30 seconds. I'm like, why did I do this? So I think there is a value in kind of creating these networks and realizing that, a lot of the questions that you might have, and you don't really know how to solve this, or you don't have the experience of doing this, or you're looking for a certain talent. I mean, if you create that kind of network, I think it can be hugely valuable. And I think most people are very willing to help. And so I think, I think that, guys have great networks, but I think women probably need to kind of invest a little bit of time in it. And it's fun.
Yeah.
It's actually very fun to kind of also have some networks with women.
Yeah.
We can moan and groan about slightly different things. So it's fun.
It's good. Actually, yesterday I did an interview with Aino from Calliditas Therapeutics. One of the advice to younger life science professionals also learn was to network. So it goes into
No, I think that you shouldn't be kind of afraid of asking questions or asking for advice or asking if anybody has an idea of how to fix a problem or do something. So it can be much more efficient.
I like them. I will just finish a few minutes more quick fire of quick questions, quick answers.
Okay.
One of them, I usually ask one advice to young life science professionals who wants to be in your shoes, maybe except networking, another advice.
Yeah, I would say, you have to try and find a mentor. I also think that actually you have to be very persistent. You can't this is an industry where actually you can't give up. So I think you really have to you have to keep on trying. You have to be very persistent, and you really have to believe in a little bit of a dream. I mean, if you don't believe in a dream and you don't want to do things that seem kind of quite difficult, pick another industry.
What's on top of your mind at the moment?
It's
except Uber to the airport.
No, it's definitely it's Hansa Biopharma 24 hours a day at the moment. That is on the top of my mind right now all the time.
You talked about books. What's one of your favorite biotech or science books?
Oh my God, what a question. Actually, I have no answer to that. I don't read those books.
Yeah.
No, I actually don't. I can't think of anything.
One mistake you made in the past 12 months.
Oof. One mistake I made in the last 12 months. I probably overextended myself and overpromised. That's going to be very difficult for me to deliver on at a high level. So I probably took on a little bit more than I could chew. Probably what I did.
Yeah. A last one new professional habit that you adopted recently.
So one of the things that I've adopted recently, and it probably comes with age, is the fact that I used to actually write everything down on a piece of paper, which I've now actually stopped finally. So now I'm actually trying to embrace the whole AI and everything digitally. So now I'm actually using much more notepads and lists all that I'm carrying with me in my phone on a daily basis. So no more papers. So that's we're hoping that that's going to make me more efficient and effective.
That's good. I like that one. Great.
Yeah.
Thanks, Renee, for the conversation.
All right.
Very fun.
Yeah. Thank you.
Safe travel.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm impressed by Renee's expertise in execution and commercialization, which is quite rare in Europe. I'm also impressed by the story of Calliditas and the potential of Hansa. If you've also enjoyed this episode, please hit the like, follow, review button. Any of these actions would help us a lot. If you want to go even further, you can make a donation with a PayPal link in the description below. If you want to see similar videos, please feel free to check out our channels where we have many more. I would be also curious to hear what you think. So if you could drop a comment wherever you are, or shoot me an email at philip@flot.bio. All right, thanks for staying to the end and catch you in the next episode.